The chill on the auction block wasn't from the autumn wind, it was the cold hand of human cruelty. In the center of the dusty town square, on a platform usually reserved for cattle, sat a small wooden crate. Inside, 2 infants, no more than a few months old, lay sleeping, wrapped in a single, thin blanket. They were a matched set, twins, their tiny chests rising and falling in blissful ignorance of the price being placed on their lives. They were being auctioned as indentured labor, their futures sold to the highest bidder until they came of age, a sentence of servitude before they could even speak. In the crowd stood Clara, her hand tucked into the arm of her new husband, Samuel. The white lace of her wedding dress, worn for this first trip to town as a married woman, felt like a mockery, a cruel joke played by fate. For months, she had endured the pitying glances and hushed whispers of the town, the bride who could not provide her husband with an heir. The doctors had called her barren, a word that felt like a branding iron on her soul, a mark of failure in a world where a woman's worth was measured in sons. Now, as she looked at the 2 abandoned children, a fierce, protective ache bloomed in her chest, a phantom kick in a womb that would never quicken. It was a pain so sharp, so profound, it stole her breath and replaced it with a fire she had never known. She saw not a burden, not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a prayer she had long ago given up on ever having answered. The auctioneer, a man with a face like a clenched fist and a soul shriveled by greed, banged his gavel. "What am I bid for this pair of foundlings? Healthy, strong. A good 20 years of work in them before you have to set them free." His voice was a rasp, a sound that scraped the humanity from the scene, leaving only the raw, ugly calculus of profit and loss. Clara felt Samuel's hand tighten on her arm, a silent command to look away, to not get involved, but her eyes were fixed on the crate, and her heart had already made a choice her mind had yet to process. A long, menacing shadow fell over the proceedings as Silas Blackwood rode into the square on a horse as black as his heart. He was a man carved from greed and granite, his wealth built on foreclosures, broken dreams, and the quiet suffering of his neighbors. He owned half the county and held the other half in a choking grip of fear and debt. He dismounted, his expensive leather boots silent in the thick dust, and surveyed the scene with the bored arrogance of a king inspecting his property. His cold gaze passed over the townspeople with contempt, lingered on Clara and her new husband with a flicker of cruel amusement, and finally settled on the crate of infants. A smile that held no warmth, no humanity, touched his thin lips. The auctioneer, who was squarely in Blackwood's pocket and danced to his tune, fumbled with his gavel like a nervous schoolboy. "Mr. Blackwood!" "An honor to see you," Sir Blackwood waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at the man. "Get on with it, Jedediah," he drawled, his voice a low rumble of absolute authority that sent a shiver through the crowd. "I'll start the bidding." $10, a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. It was an insult, a price one might pay for a sick calf, not for 2 human lives. He was making a spectacle, a public demonstration to remind everyone of his power, of how little he valued anything that did not belong to him. Samuel stiffened beside Clara, his jaw tight with disgust, but like the others, he remained silent. To cross Silas Blackwood was to invite financial ruin, to see your farm wither and your family starve. But Clara felt a fire ignite within her, a righteous rage that burned away her shame, her fear, and her sorrow. Before she could think, before she could weigh the devastating consequences, her voice, clear and steady as a church bell, cut through the tense silence. $20. The crowd turned to stare, their mouths agape. Samuel looked at her as if she had lost her mind. Silas Blackwood's eyes narrowed, the amusement in them replaced by a sliver of cold, sharp annoyance. This was not part of his carefully orchestrated plan. The bidding became a public duel, a tense and brutal exchange that crackled with unspoken animosity. Each time Clara, her voice trembling but resolute, would raise the bid by another $10, using the dowry money her father had painstakingly saved for her over 2 decades, Blackwood would counter instantly, his offers dripping with scorn and contempt. He was no longer just bidding on the infants, he was punishing Clara for her public defiance, seeking to break her in front of her new husband and all her neighbors. $50, he sneered, looking directly at Samuel, a clear and unmistakable challenge from one man of property to another. "Control your woman, farmer." She is making a fool of you, but Clara would not be controlled, not today. 60, she replied, her own gaze locked on the sleeping children, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was almost painful. She would not let this monster have them. The townspeople watched, their deep-seated fear warring with a dangerous, unfamiliar spark of admiration. They had lived under Blackwood's heavy thumb for so long, and here was this young woman, this barren bride they had pitied, standing up to him with nothing but a desperate love in her heart and a handful of her father's coins. As the price climbed to $90, a woman on the edge of the crowd, the old midwife Martha, pushed her way forward, her face pale. Her eyes were fixed not on the babies themselves, but on the threadbare blue blanket they were wrapped in. She recognized the intricate, looping pattern of bluebirds her own arthritic hands had stitched years ago. She had given it as a gift to young Evelyn, Blackwood's own sweet-natured daughter-in-law, a girl who had died in childbirth just months ago, along with her husband, Blackwood's only son, in a suspicious and violent carriage accident on a clear day. The terrible truth hit Martha with the force of a physical blow. A whispered chain of revelation passed through the stunned crowd like wildfire. These weren't just foundlings. These were Silas Blackwood's own grandchildren, the rightful heirs to the very land his son had owned, prime land that Blackwood now controlled. He wasn't just buying indentured labor, he was burying a secret, erasing his own bloodline to secure his stolen fortune. The stakes had changed dramatically. This was no longer an auction, it was an act of profound, monstrous evil unfolding in broad daylight. The hushed whispers grew into an angry, impotent murmur, but no one dared to speak the awful truth aloud. Fear of Silas Blackwood was a chain that had been forged over decades, link by heavy link. Clara had now bid every last penny of her dowry. She was empty-handed, her small purse hanging limp at her side, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. $100, Blackwood said, his voice cold and final, the sound of a coffin lid closing. He smirked at Clara, a look of pure, venomous triumph on his face. It appears your misplaced charity has its limits, Mrs. Miller. He gestured for the auctioneer to close the sale, to bring the gavel down on his victory. It was over. She had failed. The children would be his. Samuel grabbed her arm, his face pale and slick with sweat. Clara, stop this now. It is done. Think of us, of our future. We will be outcasts. He will ruin us before we even have a chance to build a life. His words were a torrent of panicked, practical sense. He was right. To continue this fight would be to throw away their life before it had even begun, to trade their future for destitution. Blackwood saw the conflict playing out on their faces and let out a soft, cruel chuckle that slithered through the air. Listen to your husband, girl. He knows the way of the world. Some are born to rule, and some are born to serve. Know your place. He turned his back on her then, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, as if she were no more significant than a piece of dust on his boot. Clara stood at a precipice. Behind her was the life she had always dreamed of, a home, a loving husband, a place in the world. Before her were two innocent lives on the verge of being consumed by a monstrous, unspeakable darkness. The world narrowed to that single, impossible choice. What would you do in her place? Would you choose the safety and security of your own life, or risk everything for a love you feel for children who are not your own? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe that true love is measured not in what it gets, but in what it is willing to sacrifice, subscribe to this channel, because Clara's decision will change not only her life, but the very soul of this broken town. Clara looked at her husband, her eyes pleading for him to understand a truth that went deeper than money or land or social standing. They are not a risk, Samuel, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so powerful it was almost holy. They are a blessing. Our blessing. She gently pulled her arm from his grasp and turned away from him, her heart breaking at the choice she had to make, at the chasm that had opened between them. She faced Silas Blackwood's broad, arrogant back, her own posture now as unyielding as his. She had nothing left to bid, no money, no power, no influence. All she had was her voice and the unshakable conviction in her heart. You will not have them, she said, the words a quiet vow, a sacred oath that carried across the entire square. Blackwood turned slowly, a look of venomous rage contorting his features, shocked by her continued defiance. And who will stop me? You? Just as his men prepared to step forward and collect the crate, a hand fell gently on Clara's shoulder. It was Samuel. He had looked into his wife's eyes and seen not madness, but a purity of purpose, a divine love that shamed his own fear. He saw the mother she was meant to be, and in that single, heart-stopping moment, he knew their future wasn't about land or heirs, but about the character of their souls. No, Samuel said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction that startled the crowd. We will. He strode forward past his wife and threw a heavy pouch of coins onto the platform. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. My savings. For the new plow and the winter seed. I bid $120. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not just a bid, it was a husband's declaration of allegiance to his wife, a farmer's defiance against the tyrant who ruled their lives. Blackwood was momentarily stunned into silence. Then, inspired by Samuel's astonishing courage, the old midwife Martha shuffled forward, adding a few tarnished silver coins to the pile. For Evelyn, she said, her voice shaking but clear. The blacksmith, a man whose brother had been ruined by Blackwood, added a fistful of dollars. And for Justice, he boomed. One by one, the townspeople came forward, a hesitant trickle that became a steady, determined stream, adding what they could to the growing pile. It was a rebellion funded by pennies and shillings, a revolution of the heart born from shared decency. The pile of money at the foot of the auction block grew into a small fortune, a monument to a community rediscovering its long-lost spine. Silas Blackwood watched, his face a mask of apoplectic fury and disbelief. He was losing, not the auction, but his iron grip of fear, the only tool he had ever known. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the people he had terrorized and belittled for so long, and it was a look he could not bear. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. The sale is void. These children are a ward of the county, and as the county's largest benefactor, I will take them into my personal care at my estate. It was a desperate, transparent power grab, a last-ditch effort to maintain control. He snapped his fingers, and two hard-faced men in his employ, known for their casual brutality, started for the platform. Their intentions were chillingly clear. They would take the children by force, and heaven help anyone who stood in their way. The crowd faltered, their courage of coin not yet translating to a courage of fists and blood. They shuffled back nervously. But Samuel and the blacksmith moved to stand beside Clara, forming a human wall in front of the precious crate. Samuel was just a farmer, and the blacksmith had only his calloused hands, but they stood their ground, their faces grim and determined. Blackwood's men paused, their sneers faltering in the face of such resolute, unexpected opposition. The tension was a razor's edge, a palpable thing that hung heavy in the air. The entire town held its breath, waiting for the violence that seemed both inevitable and terrifying. The standoff was a silent battle for the future of the town itself, fought over a simple wooden cradle of sleeping, innocent life. In that moment, Clara was no longer the barren bride to be pitied, but a warrior queen robed in righteousness, and the town, for the first time, was her army. The suffocating silence was broken by the sharp, definitive click of a gun's hammer being pulled back. But the gun was not in the hands of Blackwood's men. It was held by the town sheriff, a man long thought to be Blackwood's creature, a lawman who looked the other way for a price. He had watched the townspeople find their courage, and it had kindled a long-dormant spark of his own honor. He leveled the pistol not at the defiant townspeople, but squarely at Blackwood's two thugs. "That's far enough, boys," the sheriff said, his voice surprisingly steady. The auction was legal. The bid was won. The children belonged to the farmer and his wife. "Now back away." A Blackwood spun on him, his face purple with a rage that bordered on madness. "I own you, Miller. I put that badge on your chest," he shrieked, his composure shattering completely. "No, sir," the sheriff replied calmly, a lifetime of shame and compromise falling away from him like a heavy cloak. "You don't own any of us anymore." Not today. Defeated, exposed, and utterly alone, Blackwood could only sputter in impotent fury as Clara and Samuel stepped forward. Samuel handed the pile of money, the town's collective hope, to the stunned auctioneer. Meanwhile Clara, her hands trembling with an overwhelming, sacred love, gently lifted the two infants from the crate. One of them, a little boy, stirred and opened his eyes, looking up at her with a gaze of perfect trust. In that look, Clara's world, once a barren desert of grief, bloomed into a vibrant garden. She pulled them close, the boy and his sleeping sister, inhaling their sweet, milky scent. Her heart, so long clenched in a fist of sorrow, finally, blessedly, opened. The townspeople surrounded them, not with pity, but with a quiet, powerful respect, their faces transformed by the miracle they had helped create. They had not only saved two children, they had saved themselves. The first night in their new home was a crucible of fear, chaos, and unexpected wonder. The small farmhouse, which had always felt too quiet, too empty, was now filled with the tiny, demanding, and utterly bewildering sounds of new life. Luke and Lily, as Clara and Samuel named them, cried for milk, for comfort, for reasons the new parents could not possibly decipher. There were moments of sheer, heart-stopping panic, of overwhelming doubt that threatened to swallow them whole. Samuel, a man who could tame a wild horse and plough a perfect furrow with his eyes closed, was clumsy and terrified as he tried to change a swaddling cloth, his large hands fumbling with the delicate task. Clara, who had dreamed of this for so long, feared she was not enough, that her love could not possibly make up for her profound inexperience. They were exhausted, frayed, and utterly terrified of their own inadequacy. But sometime in the deep, dark hours before the dawn, as they stood side by side, slumped against each other in their weariness, looking down at the two peaceful, sleeping faces in the shared cradle Samuel had hastily built, a profound sense of peace settled over them. Samuel reached out and took Clara's hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers in a gesture of silent solidarity. No words were needed. In the crucible of that first, long night, their marriage had been reforged, its foundation no longer resting on the fragile ground of expectations or traditions, but on a shared, fierce, unconditional love for the two tiny souls they had sworn to protect with their lives. The silence of the house was no longer empty, it was full of promise, full of dreams. The barrenness had never been in Clara's body, it had been in their lives, a void they never knew existed until it was filled with the monumental, terrifying, and breathtakingly beautiful weight of parenthood. They were, at last, a family. Years passed, turning the dust of that harrowing memory into a golden haze of gratitude. The farm thrived beyond their wildest dreams. Samuel's practicality and Clara's fierce, intelligent devotion were a potent combination. The fields were green and the barns were full, but the true harvest, the one that truly mattered, was the one raised within the warm walls of the farmhouse. Luke and Lily grew from infants into bright, rambunctious, and kind-hearted children, their laughter the constant, joyful music of the home. Luke had Samuel's quiet strength and steady hands, while Lily had Clara's passionate, empathetic heart and a spirit that could charm the birds from the trees. Clara was no longer defined by the cruel, one-dimensional word barren. She was defined by the title she had earned through love and sacrifice: mother, protector, healer of scraped knees, and mender of broken hearts. Her love, once a dammed-up river of grief and longing, now flowed freely, nurturing not only her children but her entire community, which had been reborn on that fateful day. Silas Blackwood had faded into a bitter, lonely memory, his vast land eventually broken up and sold to the very families he had once oppressed, his legacy nothing but dust and a cautionary tale. The story of the auction became a local legend, a tale told to children about the day the town of Redemption finally found its soul. The moral of their story was woven into the very fabric of the community, that family is not a matter of blood, but of the heart. It is a choice you make, a sacred promise you keep, and if necessary, a battle you fight. A home is not just a shelter from the storm, but a lighthouse built on a foundation of courage, compassion, and a love that is bold enough to say, "I will raise them," even when the whole world tells you that you cannot. Clara's story is a testament to the fact that the most profound emptiness can be filled by the most courageous love. She saw a future where everyone else saw a burden, a family where others saw only foundlings, and by choosing love over fear, she built a world for herself and for two children who had no one. Her choice teaches us a timeless lesson, that our greatest purpose can often be found when we are willing to fight for someone else's future. If her incredible story moved you, and if you believe that one person's courage can create a family and save an entire community, then subscribe to our channel. Join us and become part of a community that knows these stories matter. They are not just entertainment, they remind us of the best parts of ourselves, of who we are meant to be. And the stories don't stop here. An even more powerful tale is waiting for you right now. What happens when a blind old man is the only one in town who can see the truth about a charming stranger who arrives promising a miracle but bringing only destruction? To find out what he sees, and what he must risk to save his town from a charismatic evil, click on the video that you see on your screen right now. Don't hesitate. The next journey into the heart of courage is waiting for you. Click now, and we will see you there.